The year was 1920. America was emerging from the shadows of the Great War, and Salem, Massachusetts was a quiet New England town, still haunted by its infamous past. But in the heart of this historic town, at St. Peter and Paul's Church, events were about to unfold that would add a new chapter to Salem's dark legacy. I am here to tell you a true story that has been kept hidden for decades. It begins on an autumn evening in 1920, when church caretaker Thomas Peterson first heard something that would change his life forever. Thomas Peterson had worked as the church caretaker for 20 years. A 58-year-old widower, he had devoted his life to God's house. That evening, around 10 o'clock, he finished his usual duties, extinguished the candles, checked the doors, said his prayers. But as he was about to leave through the sacristy, he heard it, a sound from below. Not the settling of old wood or the scurrying of mice. This was different. It sounded like scratching, deliberate, rhythmic scratching coming from beneath the church floor. Thomas froze. The sound continued for exactly 37 seconds. He counted every one. Then silence. He convinced himself it was nothing. Old churches make sounds. But that night, as he lay in his small apartment behind the church, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that scratching again. The next evening, Thomas stayed longer. He sat in the back pew, waiting. At precisely 10:17 p.m., it began again. This time, he was certain. The sound was coming from directly beneath the altar. But now there was something else. Between the scratching sounds, he heard what sounded like whispers, faint but unmistakably human voices, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Not English, not Latin, not any European language he'd ever heard. Something older. His hands trembling, Thomas lit a candle and approached the altar. The marble floor felt cold beneath his knees as he pressed his ear to the ground. The whispers stopped immediately, as if they knew he was listening. By the third night, Thomas had convinced himself he was losing his mind. But Father Francis Reed, the parish priest, arrived unexpectedly for evening prayers. The old priest was known for his sharp mind and skeptical nature. "Father," Thomas whispered, "do you hear that?" Father Reed listened. His face went pale. Not only did he hear the scratching and whispers, but now there was a new sound, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the church. "We're going down there," Father Reed declared, his voice barely steady. The church basement was accessed through a narrow stone staircase behind the altar. Father Reed and Thomas descended with oil lamps, their shadows dancing grotesquely on the ancient walls. The basement was larger than either man remembered. Stone archways extended into darkness, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and something else, something sweet and rotting. As they ventured deeper, their lamps illuminated symbols carved into the walls. Not Christian symbols, but something far older. Celtic spirals, interlocking circles, and figures that looked almost human but wrong. The proportions were off, the limbs too long, the faces eyeless. Then Thomas stumbled. His lamp fell, shattering on the stone floor. In the sudden darkness, they heard it clearly. Dozens of voices whispering in unison, growing louder, more urgent. Father Reed grabbed Thomas, and they fled up the stairs, not stopping until they reached the main church. Behind them, the whispers followed, echoing up from the depths like a chorus of the damned. Father Reed contacted Bishop William O'Connell in Boston, but he couldn't bring himself to describe what he had experienced. Instead, he requested permission to conduct a structural inspection of the church basement. The bishop sent Father Joseph Matthews, a learned priest who had studied at the Vatican and was known for his rational approach to unexplained phenomena. He arrived with 2 seminarians and a local stonemason named Victor Clark. Working by daylight, the team mapped the basement systematically. Victor, examining the walls with a professional eye, made a disturbing discovery. One section of the wall was different. Newer stone, probably added in the 1800s. "This wall," Victor announced, running his weathered hands over the stones, "it's not part of the original foundation. Someone walled something up here." Father Matthews made the decision to break through. The first stones came away easily, too easily, as if they were never meant to keep something out, but to keep something in. Behind the wall was a chamber. The stench that emerged was indescribable, not just decay, but something that made the men's stomachs turn and their vision blur. One of the seminarians vomited immediately. The chamber was circular, about 10 feet in diameter. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols they had seen before, but these were different, carved deeper, filled with a dark substance that might have once been blood. In the center of the room was a stone table, obviously ancient. Its surface was stained black and worn smooth by use. Scattered around it were dozens of human bones, but arranged in patterns that defied explanation. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Father Matthews noticed that one section of the floor was different, raised slightly, as if something lay beneath. Using tools from the stonemason, they pried up the stones. Beneath was a well, not filled with water, but with more bones. Human bones. Hundreds of them, extending down into darkness beyond the reach of their lamps. As they peered into the depths, they heard it again, the whispers. But now they could make out individual words. Latin phrases, but spoken backwards. Prayers to God, but inverted, twisted into something blasphemous. In a niche carved into the wall, wrapped in oiled leather, they found a manuscript, written in Latin, with annotations in what appeared to be ancient Celtic Ogham script, the sacred writing of the Druids. Father Matthews, the only one who could read Latin fluently, began to translate. What he read made his blood run cold. The manuscript detailed rituals performed in this chamber over centuries. Not Christian rituals, but something far older. The chamber had been a sacred site of the Celtic Druids, where they communed with entities they called the Otherworld Dwellers beings that existed in the spaces between the world of the living and the dead. According to the text, these rituals continued even after Christianity arrived. Secret practitioners would gather in the chamber, offering blood and souls to maintain a pact with these entities. In exchange, the Otherworld Dwellers would grant them knowledge of future events, of hidden treasures, of how to commune with the dead. The most chilling part of the manuscript was a list of names, dates, and descriptions. Each entry described a person who had been brought to the chamber. Not all entries described death. Some described something worse. Martin Cleary, aged 34, offered on Samhain, 1654. His body returned to his family, but his mind remained below. Lived 7 more years, speaking only the words of the Otherworld Dwellers. Ellen Whitmore, aged 19, taken on the winter solstice, 1701, found 3 days later in the town square, alive but changed. Her eyes had turned completely white, and she spoke prophecies that came true with terrible accuracy. The final entry was dated 1863. Father Benedict Anderson, aged 67, came to the chamber of his own will, seeking to end the pact. His screams were heard through the church floor for 3 days. On the 4th day, silence. The chamber was sealed by order of the town council. That night, none of the men who had entered the chamber slept peacefully. Father Matthews was awakened at 3 a.m. by the sound of his own voice, but he wasn't speaking. The voice seemed to come from inside his throat, reciting Latin phrases from the manuscript in that same backwards, twisted manner. Victor the stonemason found himself in his workshop at dawn, with no memory of how he got there. His tools were arranged in ritualistic patterns on his workbench, and carved into the wood were symbols he had never seen before, except in that chamber. But Thomas Peterson experienced the worst. He awoke to find his room filled with the stench from the chamber. And standing at the foot of his bed was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with skin like parchment and hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. The figure spoke, but its voice came from everywhere at once. The seal is broken. The pact must be renewed. Choose, keeper of the sacred place. Choose, or we will choose for you. When Thomas blinked, the figure was gone. But on his bedsheets, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, 7 days. Over the next 3 days, the manifestations intensified throughout Salem. Mrs. Anna Butler, who lived near the church, reported that her infant son would not stop crying at night. When she went to comfort him, she found him staring at the wall, following something with his eyes as if watching a figure move back and forth. There was nothing there. The local doctor, Dr. William Shaw, reported a sudden increase in patients suffering from severe nightmares. All described the same dream, standing in a dark chamber, while pale figures with no eyes whispered secrets that burned their minds to hear. At the local school, children began drawing the same symbols during their lessons, the spiral patterns from the chamber walls. When teachers asked where they had seen these symbols, the children couldn't remember. They just knew they had to draw them. On October 24th, young Peter Casey, a 16-year-old altar boy, vanished. His mother found his bed empty at dawn, the window open despite the cold October wind. His footprints in the frost led directly to the church. Father Reed found Peter 3 hours later, standing in the main aisle of the church, staring at the altar. The boy was alive but changed. His skin was cold as marble, and when he spoke, his voice echoed as if coming from a great depth. "They're waiting," Peter whispered. "They've been waiting so long. The chamber needs to be opened properly. The ritual needs to be completed." When Father Reed touched the boy's shoulder, Peter collapsed. He was rushed to the doctor, where he remained in a catatonic state for 6 days. When he finally awoke, he had no memory of the previous week, but he refused to enter the church ever again. That evening, Father Matthews decided to return to the chamber alone. He was a man of science as well as faith, and he needed to understand what they were dealing with. Armed with multiple oil lamps and a crucifix, he descended into the basement. The sealed wall had been rebuilt, but as he approached it, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The new mortar was seeping a dark liquid. Not water, something thick and red that pooled on the floor and gave off that same sickly sweet smell. As he watched, the liquid began to move, flowing across the floor in deliberate patterns, forming symbols. The same symbols from the manuscript, but now they were writing themselves before his eyes. Father Matthews began to pray, but the words stuck in his throat. From behind the sealed wall came a sound like hundreds of fingernails scratching against stone. And underneath that, the whispers, no longer faint, but loud enough that he could make out individual words. They were calling his name. As Father Matthews turned to flee, every lamp in the basement went out simultaneously. In the absolute darkness, he felt something brush against his face. Fingers, cold and impossibly long, tracing patterns on his cheek. A voice spoke directly into his ear, so close he could feel breath that wasn't there. You could not seal what was never meant to be contained. The Otherworld Dwellers have waited since before your Christ walked the earth. 7 days from the breaking of the seal. 7 days to renew the pact. Or 7 souls will be taken as payment for the delay. When Father Matthews finally escaped the basement, he found his cheek bleeding. In the mirror, he saw that the cold fingers had carved a symbol into his flesh. A spiral within a circle, the mark of the Otherworld Dwellers. The town began to experience what locals would later call the haunting days. Every night at exactly 10:17 p.m., every dog in Salem would begin howling in unison. The sound was so terrifying that people barricaded themselves in their homes. George Walsh, the town's blacksmith, was working late when he heard footsteps outside his shop. Through the window, he saw a procession of figures walking toward the church. They moved in perfect synchronization, their heads bowed, their faces hidden by shadows, that seemed deeper than the night itself. What horrified George most was that he recognized some of the figures. Old Mrs. Patricia Clemens, who had died 2 years ago. Young Stephen Roberts, killed in the war. They walked among the living figures, indistinguishable except for the fact that their feet never quite touched the ground. George followed at a distance, his heart pounding. The procession entered the church through doors that should have been locked. Inside, he could see lights, not the warm glow of candles, but a cold blue phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The blacksmith watched through a crack in the door as the figures arranged themselves in a circle around the altar. They began to chant in that same ancient language, their voices creating harmonies that no human throat should be able to produce. Then the floor beneath the altar began to glow. The marble became transparent, revealing the chamber below. And from that chamber, something began to rise. George ran. He didn't stop running until he reached his home, where he barricaded the door and didn't emerge for 3 days. The second disappearance occurred during broad daylight. Mary Stevenson, a 34-year-old widow who cleaned the church, simply vanished while polishing the pews. Father Reed found her cleaning cloth still damp on the altar rail, but Mary was nowhere to be found. Unlike young Peter, Mary was never found. But that night, several residents reported seeing her face in their windows, pressed against the glass from the outside, her mouth moving as if speaking, but no sound emerging. Her eyes had turned completely black. Dr. William Shaw was summoned to examine a young girl named Alice Reynolds. The 8-year-old had been found by her parents speaking fluent Latin in her sleep, Latin that she had never learned, reciting prayers that had been forgotten for centuries. When Dr. Shaw examined her, he found that the girl's body temperature had dropped to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, yet she showed no signs of hypothermia. Her pulse was slow but steady, and most disturbing of all, she cast no reflection in the mirror. "Doctor," the little girl said, opening her eyes and speaking in a voice far too mature for her age, "they want you to know that 5 days remain. The physician will be needed when the time comes. You will prepare the vessels." Dr. Shaw stumbled backward. "What vessels?" Alice smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. "The bodies, doctor. Someone needs to prepare the bodies." The girl fell into a deep sleep and remembered nothing when she awoke the next morning. But for the rest of her life, she would avoid the church, crossing herself and whispering prayers whenever she passed it. The mayor of Salem, Leonard Barnes, received visitors that night. 3 figures in dark robes appeared at his door, speaking in perfect English, but with accents he couldn't place. "Mayor Barnes," the lead figure said, "we represent the old covenant. The time has come to honor the agreement your predecessors made with our associates. You have 48 hours to gather 7 volunteers, or 7 will be chosen for you." "What agreement?" Mayor Barnes demanded. "I know of no such thing." The figure produced a document, ancient parchment covered in signatures. The mayor recognized some of the names, previous mayors, town officials, going back centuries. At the bottom was a space for his signature. "The church stands on sacred ground," the figure explained. "Ground that was consecrated long before your Christian God was worshipped in these lands. The pact ensures peace between the upper world and the lower world. But the seal has been broken and payment is due." When Mayor Barnes refused to sign, the figures vanished like smoke. But on his desk, burned into the wood, was the spiral symbol, and underneath it the words, 2 days. The penultimate day brought the most terrifying manifestation yet. Every mirror in Salem began showing the same reflection. Not the person looking into it, but the chamber beneath the church. Families covered their mirrors with cloth, but the visions seeped through. Children reported seeing faces in the water when they bent to drink from wells. The faces would mouth warnings. "Don't go to the church. Don't listen to the bells. Don't let them take you below." That evening, the church bells began ringing on their own. Not the normal pattern of calls to prayer, but a complex rhythm that seemed to burrow into people's minds. Those who heard it reported feeling an irresistible urge to walk toward the church. 17 people did walk toward the church that night. Families watched in horror as their loved ones, children, grandparents, newlyweds, walked like sleepwalkers through the streets. Father Reed stood at the church doors, physically blocking their entry. "You cannot enter," he shouted. "In the name of Christ, you cannot enter." The 17 stopped as if hitting an invisible wall. They stood there until dawn, swaying slightly, their eyes closed. When the sun rose, they collapsed where they stood. All survived, but none remembered the night. Halloween, All Hallows Eve. The night when the boundaries between worlds grew thin. Father Matthews had spent the day in prayer and preparation. If the entities wanted a renewal of the pact, he would give them something else, a final confrontation. He gathered salt, holy water, and every relic the church possessed. As darkness fell, he entered the church alone, despite pleas from Father Reed and Thomas to wait for help from Boston. The basement was different now. The sealed wall had crumbled away on its own, revealing the chamber in all its ancient horror. But the chamber itself had changed. It was larger, its walls extending into impossible distances. The well in the center had become a yawning chasm that seemed to breathe. As midnight approached, the whispers began. But now Father Matthews could understand them. They spoke of the old pact, of the blood that had been spilled on the stone table for generations, of the balance that kept the Otherworld Dwellers from claiming the surface world. The pact was simple. A voice spoke from the well, emanating from everywhere and nowhere. 7 souls every 7 years, freely given or taken by force. Your Christian church was built on our sacred ground, but we allowed it as long as the old agreement was honored. But the last payment was not made in 1863. Father Anderson tried to break the pact. His soul still screams in our realm. Now the debt has grown. 49 souls for the 7 payments missed. Father Matthews stood his ground. I offer myself instead. 1 soul for 49. The innocent will not pay for ancient crimes. The chamber fell silent. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from the well. Not human shapes, but things that might have once been human, stretched and twisted by centuries in the otherworld realm. Their skin was translucent, showing dark veins beneath. Their eyes were hollow caverns, and when they opened their mouths, darkness poured out like liquid. 1 soul, the largest entity, spoke, its voice like grinding stone. But not yours, priest. Your faith makes you unpalatable to us. We require someone who has already been touched by our realm. The entity gestured, and Father Matthews understood. They wanted Thomas Peterson, the man who had first heard their call, whose mind they had already begun to claim. And if I refuse, then at dawn, 49 residents of this town will walk into the church. They will descend into our realm willingly, with smiles on their faces and songs in their hearts. Children, mothers, fathers, it matters not to us. Father Matthews closed his eyes. He thought of little Alice, of the other children who had already been touched by this evil. He thought of the 17 people who had walked like zombies toward the church. There is another way, he said finally. Let me seal the chamber permanently. Let me break the pact forever. But in exchange, I will ensure that this place is never forgotten. The story will be preserved, the warning maintained. The entities considered this. The seal would need to be special, not stone and mortar, but something that binds us by our own laws. Blood freely given, words of power spoken in the old tongue, and a guardian who will watch through generations. What happened next was witnessed only by Father Matthews, and he never spoke of it in detail. But the next morning, Thomas Peterson was found in the church, alive but forever changed. His hair had turned completely white overnight, and he spoke little for the rest of his days. The chamber was sealed with a mixture of blessed concrete and iron filings, inscribed with both Christian symbols and the older protective signs. Father Matthews performed a ritual that combined Catholic exorcism with fragments of Celtic protective ceremonies, creating something entirely new, a seal that honored both the old powers and the new faith. The strange manifestations ceased immediately after the sealing. The town returned to normal, but those who had experienced the 7 days were forever changed. Thomas Peterson continued as church caretaker for another 30 years, but he never spoke above a whisper again. Every night, he would walk 3 times around the church, sprinkling salt and whispering prayers in a mixture of English and Latin. Father Matthews requested a transfer to a remote monastery, where he spent the rest of his life studying ancient Celtic religions and their interaction with Christianity. His notebooks, filled with symbols and warnings, were sealed in church archives. Dr. Shaw left Salem within a year, but not before documenting every detail of the medical anomalies he had witnessed. His report was buried in church records and forgotten. True to the bargain, the church established a tradition of guardianship. Every caretaker was told a version of the story and instructed to watch for signs. The basement was declared off-limits, accessible only to senior clergy with special permission. But the most disturbing aspect of the aftermath was discovered years later. Church records showed that every 7 years since 1920, exactly 7 people in Salem had died under mysterious circumstances. Not violent deaths, but unexplained ones. Heart attacks in healthy young people, accidents that defied logic, illnesses that baffled doctors. It was as if the Otherworld Dwellers had found another way to collect their due. When the church underwent major renovations in the 1980s, workers reported strange discoveries. The sealed chamber had partially collapsed, revealing older chambers beneath. Archaeologists found evidence of ritual activity dating back over 1,000 years. Most disturbing was their discovery of a secondary well, deeper than the first. Ground-penetrating radar suggested it extended down over 200 feet, connecting to a network of natural caves beneath Salem. One archaeologist, Victor Clark Jr., grandson of the stonemason Victor, descended into the well with modern equipment. He was found the next morning, alive but speaking only in an unknown language. Authorities classified the incident and sealed the area with concrete. Victor spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric facility, drawing the same symbols over and over again on every available surface. St. Peter and Paul's Church still stands in Salem. The basement remains sealed, and church policy strictly forbids anyone from disturbing the concrete barriers installed in the 1980s. But locals know to listen carefully during October nights. Some say you can still hear the scratching, very faintly, coming from beneath the church floor. Others report seeing figures in old-fashioned clothing walking toward the church at exactly 10:17 p.m., only to vanish when you look directly at them. The church caretaker, there is always a caretaker, continues the tradition established by Thomas Peterson. Every night, salt is sprinkled around the church perimeter. Every morning, they check the basement door to ensure the seals remain intact. And every 7 years, on October 31st, the current caretaker performs a ritual that is part Catholic blessing, part Celtic protection ceremony. They will not speak of what this ritual entails, but church records show that it has been performed without fail since 1920. The Otherworld Dwellers may be sealed, but they are not gone. They wait beneath Salem in chambers that extend deeper than anyone has ever mapped, in spaces where time moves differently and the laws of the surface world hold no power. And sometimes on the quietest nights, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, residents of Salem can hear them, still whispering, still waiting, still counting the years until the next opportunity to reclaim what they believe has always been theirs.